The young German soldier emerged from the forest with his hands raised, his Mauser rifle slung across his back in surrender position. 19-year-old Gefreiter Heinrich Waldmann of the 21st Panzer Division had made a choice that Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, had declared punishable by death. Anyone who, without the express permission of the Führer, leaves his district when it is under enemy attack and fails to fight to the bitter end, Bormann had decreed, is scum and will be treated as a deserter. But as American infantrymen of the Third Army approached through the Bavarian countryside in late April 1945, Waldmann had calculated his odds. Death by execution for desertion, or death by Soviet capture if he fled east. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple. Waldmann was one of 2.8 million German soldiers who would surrender to Western Allied forces between D-Day and April 30, 1945. This staggering number represented the largest military capitulation in modern history, dwarfing even the mass surrenders at Stalingrad. Yet behind these statistics lay three distinct stories of collapse: the Wehrmacht's systematic disintegration in the West, Imperial Japan's fanatical resistance to the very end, and Fascist Italy's dramatic reversal from Axis partner to Allied co-belligerent. Each nation's approach to surrender revealed not just military strategy, but fundamental cultural attitudes toward defeat, honor, and survival. The German experience differed dramatically between East and West. While German forces facing the Red Army fought to the death, often choosing suicide over capture, those confronting American and British forces increasingly chose surrender without resistance. This disparity stemmed from harsh reality. 90% of German prisoners taken at Stalingrad perished in Soviet captivity, while German POWs in Western hands generally survived. Major Friedrich Weissner of the 6th Mountain Division, captured near Munich in May 1945, later wrote, "We had heard the stories from the East. Better to surrender to the Americans and hope to see home again than fight the Soviets and guarantee we never would." The numbers tell the story of Wehrmacht collapse. In March 1945 alone, over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered to Western forces as Hitler's prohibition against strategic withdrawal trapped entire divisions west of the Rhine. General Dwight Eisenhower referred to the Wehrmacht as a whipped army by March 27, noting that his forces encountered virtually no resistance in their drive toward Germany's heartland. The Times reported 31,000 Germans surrendering on March 24 and 40,000 on March 25. Many Allied soldiers reported German troops walking mile after mile, searching for Americans willing to accept their surrender. But surrender carried deadly risks under Nazi law. At least 15,000 German soldiers were executed for desertion alone during the war, with up to 50,000 killed for various acts of insubordination. Field courts-martial operated with lethal efficiency, often sentencing and executing soldiers within hours of capture or suspected cowardice. Oberstfreiter Walter Brennan of the 15th Infantry Division witnessed one such execution near Aachen in February 1945. They shot him against the church wall for attempting to surrender to British forces. The Hauptmann said it was to maintain discipline. But we all knew the war was lost. Martin Bormann's iron grip on Nazi Party doctrine extended to these harsh desertion policies. As head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and Hitler's closest aide, Bormann wielded enormous influence over military justice. His edicts reached down to company level, demanding that any soldier who left his position without permission face immediate court-martial. The order was clear: victory or death, with no middle ground permitted. Bormann himself would die attempting to flee Berlin on May 2, 1945. After Hitler's suicide, his body not discovered and confirmed until 1973 through DNA testing. The infrastructure of surrender varied dramatically by theater. In Germany's industrial heartland, factory workers often found themselves in the strange position of surrendering alongside Wehrmacht soldiers. At the Krupp Works in Essen, Foreman Gustav Hartmann directed the shutdown of steel production on April 10, 1945, as British forces approached. "We had been producing armor plate until the very end," Hartmann recalled. "Then suddenly we were raising white flags and hoping the British would protect us from the SS units still in the city." German industrial output had fallen to one-third of 1939 levels by war's end, with entire factory complexes reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The American military government quickly recognized the strategic value of German technical expertise. Operation Paperclip, launched immediately after German surrender, systematically harvested German patents, research data, and scientific personnel. The intellectual reparations extracted by the United States and United Kingdom amounted to close to $10 billion in today's currency. German researchers found themselves in an unusual position. Technically prisoners, yet valuable assets whose cooperation could determine their post-war fate. Dr. Ernst Müller, a rocket engineer at Peenemünde, surrendered to American forces on May 5, 1945, and within months found himself working on U.S. missile programs. The contrast with Imperial Japan's surrender psychology could not have been starker. Japan had never been successfully invaded or lost a war in its history before 1945. This cultural reality shaped every aspect of Japanese military doctrine and soldier psychology. When Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement was broadcast on August 15, 1945, it marked not just military defeat, but the shattering of a fundamental worldview. Nearly 5,000 kamikaze pilots had already died in spectacular suicide attacks, representing Japan's ultimate expression of resistance to surrender. Lieutenant Saburo Kitamura of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Attack Units exemplified this mindset. Based at Kanoya Airfield on Kyushu in August 1945, Kitamura had volunteered for a kamikaze mission scheduled for August 16. The Emperor's surrender announcement on August 15 left him in psychological limbo. "We had trained to die for the Emperor," he later wrote. "To be told to live for him instead was incomprehensible. Some of my squadron mates wept. Others raged. A few attempted seppuku rather than accept defeat." The Japanese military's resistance to surrender extended even after the Emperor's announcement. 3 princes of the imperial family had to be dispatched personally to deliver ceasefire orders to senior commanders, as regular communications proved insufficient. The commanders of Japanese forces in China and the southern area initially declared they would not comply with surrender orders. These commands controlled between a quarter and a third of all Japanese servicemen, representing over 1 million troops. Only direct intervention by imperial emissaries finally secured compliance. An attempted military coup on the night of August 14-15 nearly prevented Japan's surrender entirely. Major Kenji Hatanaka led a faction of middle-ranking officers who seized control of the imperial palace and burned Prime Minister Suzuki's residence. Their goal was to prevent broadcast of the Emperor's surrender announcement and continue the war. The coup collapsed at dawn on August 15, but it demonstrated how close Japan came to rejecting surrender even after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, was carefully choreographed to emphasize Japan's complete defeat. 207 Allied warships filled Tokyo Bay, with Missouri anchored in the exact spot where Commodore Matthew Perry had dropped anchor in 1853 to force Japan's opening to Western trade. General MacArthur orchestrated an umbrella of B-29 bombers and carrier aircraft circling above the ceremony, while Missouri's anti-aircraft guns remained manned in case of kamikaze attack. No such attack materialized, but the precaution reflected real concerns about Japanese military fanatics. The Italian experience of surrender presented yet another model entirely. Italy became the first Axis nation to formally surrender to Allied forces, but the process proved chaotic and bloody. On September 8, 1943, General Eisenhower announced Italy's armistice with the Allies, but the Wehrmacht's reaction was swift and brutal. Operation Axis, Hitler's occupation of Italy, began immediately. German forces disarmed entire Italian divisions, often executing those who resisted. Captain Alessandro Bernardini of the Acqui Division experienced Germany's violent response firsthand on the Greek island of Cephalonia. When Italian forces attempted to resist German disarmament, Wehrmacht troops murdered 1,646 Italian soldiers in mass executions. Bernardini survived by feigning death among the corpses. "The Germans lined us up in groups of 10, he testified after the war. "They machine-gunned us systematically. Those who were wounded but still breathing, they finished with pistol shots to the head. I lay still for 6 hours until darkness came." Marshal Pietro Badoglio's government had secretly negotiated the armistice while publicly maintaining loyalty to the Axis. This duplicity created chaos when the surrender was announced. King Victor Emmanuel III and Badoglio fled Rome for southeastern Italy, leaving the Italian military without clear leadership. Many Italian units simply disintegrated, while others attempted to fight both German occupiers and advancing Allied forces simultaneously. The result was military catastrophe and civil war. The Regia Marina, Italy's Royal Navy, faced particular challenges during the surrender. When the battleship Roma attempted to sail to an Allied port in North Africa, German bombers sank her with radio-controlled Fritz X guided missiles. Roma had the dubious distinction of becoming the first ship ever sunk by a guided missile. More than 1,500 crewmen drowned. Other Italian naval vessels successfully reached Allied ports, but the Italian fleet's surrender marked the end of Italy as a significant naval power. Factory production in Italy had already been crippled by Allied bombing before the armistice. The Fiat works in Turin, Alfa Romeo plants in Milan, and Ansaldo shipyards in Genoa all ceased military production by summer 1943. Workers often found themselves caught between German occupation forces demanding continued production and Italian resistance groups sabotaging war industries. Giuseppe Moretti, a lathe operator at the Fiat Mirafiori plant, recalled the impossible situation. The Germans wanted us to keep making aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. The partisans threatened to kill anyone who cooperated. We tried to work slowly and produce as little as possible, but it was dangerous either way. The transition from Axis partner to Allied co-belligerent created unique military situations. Italian forces found themselves fighting alongside British and American troops against their former German allies. The Italian co-belligerent army, formed from units that had remained loyal to Badoglio's government, participated in Allied operations up the Italian peninsula. These troops faced the complex psychology of fighting former allies while serving new masters they had been conditioned to view as enemies. Meanwhile, northern Italy remained under German occupation through the Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state established after his rescue by German paratroopers. This created a bizarre situation where Italian forces fought on both sides simultaneously. Regular Italian army units served with the Allies in the south, while Republican National Army troops fought for the Germans in the north. Italian partisans operated behind German lines, adding a third dimension to the conflict. The result was a complex civil war that lasted until Germany's final surrender in May 1945. The production statistics from the three Axis powers reveal the industrial dimensions of their respective collapses. Germany's industrial output had fallen to 67% of 1938 levels by 1944, with further decline in early 1945. Critical shortages of coal, steel, and transportation paralyzed remaining production. The Allied bombing campaign against oil production proved particularly devastating. Between May 1944 and May 1945, systematic bombing of German synthetic fuel plants reduced aviation gasoline production by 90%. Oberingenieur Hermann Hoffmann managed the Luna synthetic fuel plant until its capture by American forces in April 1945. The facility had been bombed repeatedly but continued limited production until the end. "We were producing perhaps 10% of our capacity," Hoffmann reported to his American interrogators. "The workers were exhausted, equipment was failing constantly, and we had no spare parts. The plant was essentially dead, but we kept going because stopping meant execution for sabotage." Japanese industrial production followed a different pattern, maintaining higher output levels until the very end due to geographic protection from bombing until 1944. However, the American submarine blockade and aerial mining campaign gradually strangled Japanese industry. By summer 1945, Japanese steel production had fallen to half of 1944 levels due to raw material shortages. The bombing of Japanese cities, particularly the firebombing campaign that began with the March 9-10 Tokyo raid, further disrupted production networks. Yoshio Tanaka, production manager at the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashi, witnessed the systematic destruction of Japanese aviation manufacturing. "The B-29s came first in November 1944, he recorded in his diary. "We dispersed production to smaller facilities, but they found those too. By June 1945, we were assembling fighters in school gymnasiums and temple courtyards. quality control became impossible. Many aircraft we delivered were not truly airworthy. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 had effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force. The loss of 430 carrier aircraft and their experienced pilots in what American aviators called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot forced Japan to rely increasingly on kamikaze tactics. These suicide attacks represented a fundamental shift from professional military aviation to desperate last measures. Italian industrial collapse preceded military surrender by months. The loss of North African territories cut Italy off from critical raw materials, while Allied bombing of northern industrial centers disrupted production networks. By spring 1943, Italian aircraft production had fallen to a trickle, forcing the Regia Aeronautica to rely increasingly on obsolescent aircraft against modern Allied fighters. The psychological impact on Italian workers was severe, as many recognized that continued war meant inevitable defeat. The aftermath of surrender varied dramatically among the three Axis powers. Germany faced complete occupation and the dismantling of its industrial capacity. The Allied Control Council implemented the Morgenthau Plan's initial provisions, removing equipment from 706 manufacturing plants by 1950. German coal was sold at half its production cost, extracting roughly $200 million from the German economy between May 1945 and September 1947. The confiscation of German patents and industrial processes represented an additional transfer of wealth to the victorious Allies. German prisoners of war faced vastly different fates depending on their captors. While Western Allied camps generally provided adequate food and medical care, Soviet camps proved far more deadly. Approximately one-third of German POWs in Soviet captivity died, often during forced labor that continued for up to 10 years after the war's end. This disparity reinforced the German preference for Western surrender that had characterized the war's final months. Japanese surrender created different challenges. Unlike Germany, Japan retained its government structure under Allied occupation, though real power rested with General MacArthur's administration. The psychological shock of defeat and occupation profoundly affected Japanese society, but the preservation of the emperor system provided continuity that eased the transition. Many Japanese soldiers and civilians struggled with the concept of survival after preparing mentally for death. Suicide rates increased in the immediate post-surrender period as some Japanese found existence under occupation unbearable. The treatment of Japanese prisoners varied by theater and timing. Those captured early in the war often faced harsh conditions, particularly in the Pacific where mutual racial hatred intensified combat. However, Japanese troops who surrendered in the final months generally received better treatment as Allied forces prepared for occupation duties. The massive repatriation effort required to return millions of Japanese servicemen from across the Pacific created logistical challenges that lasted into 1947. Italy's partition into German-occupied North and Allied-controlled South created unique post-surrender dynamics. The Italian co-belligerent armies' participation in Allied operations helped legitimize the Badoglio government's claim to represent Italian interests. However, the presence of Italian Social Republic forces fighting for Germany complicated post-war reconciliation. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Italy faced the challenge of reintegrating populations that had fought on opposite sides of the Civil War. The human cost of these surrenders extended far beyond military casualties. German civilian deaths from bombing, displacement, and starvation totaled approximately 600,000 by war's end. The massive displacement of populations, including over 12 million ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, created humanitarian crises that lasted years. The Rheinweisenlager camps established by Western Allies to hold German prisoners initially lacked adequate shelter and sanitation, leading to disease outbreaks and deaths among the hundreds of thousands of captured Wehrmacht personnel. Japanese civilian casualties from the strategic bombing campaign reached catastrophic levels. The March 9-10 firebombing of Tokyo alone killed an estimated 100,000 people, more than either atomic bomb. The psychological impact of these attacks contributed to Emperor Hirohito's decision to surrender, as he feared the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. Post-surrender Japan faced severe food shortages and the challenge of reintegrating 6 million military personnel and civilians from overseas territories. Italian civilian casualties during the German occupation and subsequent fighting reached over 150,000 deaths. The partisan war against German occupation forces created cycles of reprisal and counter-reprisal that devastated entire communities. The reconstruction of Italy required not only physical rebuilding but social healing between former enemies and collaborators. The economic dimensions of surrender revealed the true scope of Axis defeat. German reparations and dismantling removed an estimated $20 billion in value from the German economy through 1950. The confiscation of intellectual property, including patents for jet engines, rockets, and advanced metallurgy, provided Allied industries with technological advances worth additional billions. German scientists and engineers found themselves in demand by Allied governments seeking to exploit their expertise, creating a brain drain that lasted decades. Japan's economic collapse was equally severe but took different forms. The loss of overseas territories eliminated access to raw materials and markets that had sustained Japanese expansion since the Meiji era. The destruction of the merchant marine, with 90% of Japanese shipping sunk by war's end, left Japan dependent on Allied vessels for basic imports. The dismantling of Japanese military industries and the prohibition on aircraft production eliminated entire sectors of the economy. Italian economic recovery proved complicated by the country's division and civil war. Northern Italy's industrial capacity remained largely intact under German occupation, but faced destruction during the final Allied offensive. Southern Italy, under Allied control, struggled with damaged infrastructure and disrupted trade networks. The need to rebuild while supporting Allied military operations strained Italian resources throughout the occupation period. The technological transfer from defeated Axis powers to the Allies represented one of the war's most significant but least visible consequences. German advances in jet propulsion, guided missiles, and rocket technology accelerated Allied programs by years or decades. The United States and Soviet Union competed intensively to recruit German scientists and acquire German research data. Dr. Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde became the foundation of American space and missile programs, while Soviet forces captured other German rocket specialists for their own projects. Japanese technological contributions proved more limited but still significant. Japanese advances in radar, sonar, and optical systems provided insights for Allied manufacturers. The examination of Japanese aircraft revealed design innovations in lightweight construction and long-range capability that influenced post-war aviation development. However, Japan's technological transfer was hampered by the systematic destruction of research facilities and documentation in the final months of the war. Italian contributions to technological transfer were minimal due to the country's earlier surrender and limited research capabilities. However, Italian expertise in naval architecture and aircraft design provided some value to Allied reconstruction efforts. The surrender of the Italian fleet allowed detailed examination of Italian submarine and torpedo technology, though most proved inferior to Allied equivalents by 1943. The intelligence dimensions of surrender operations revealed crucial insights into Axis military capabilities and limitations. German signals intelligence had been compromised by Allied code-breaking efforts throughout the war, contributing to the Wehrmacht's inability to coordinate effective resistance in the final months. The capture of German cryptographic equipment and personnel provided additional insights into Axis communications security. Japanese communications intelligence proved particularly valuable due to Japan's continued use of compromised codes until surrender. The Magic Intelligence Program allowed Allied forces to anticipate Japanese military movements and diplomatic initiatives throughout the war's final year. The surrender negotiations themselves were monitored through intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications, giving Allied leaders unprecedented insight into Japanese decision-making processes. Italian intelligence capabilities had been limited throughout the war and provided little valuable information after surrender. However, Italian military personnel proved valuable sources of information about German defensive preparations and troop movements in Italy. The cooperation of Italian naval officers allowed Allied forces to identify German naval bases and submarine facilities throughout the Mediterranean. The propaganda aspects of surrender operations demonstrated the importance of psychological warfare in modern conflict. German morale collapsed as much from the recognition of inevitable defeat as from military pressure. Allied leaflet campaigns encouraging surrender proved increasingly effective as German soldiers recognized their hopeless situation. The promise of good treatment in Allied custody contrasted sharply with Nazi propaganda about Allied brutality, encouraging mass surrenders in the war's final weeks. Japanese resistance to surrender propaganda proved much more effective, with most Japanese troops fighting to the death despite hopeless odds. The emperor's personal intervention was essential to overcome this resistance, demonstrating the power of traditional authority even in modern warfare. The Japanese military's attempts to prevent the emperor's surrender announcement through the August 14 coup attempt showed how close Japan came to continuing the war despite atomic bombing and Soviet invasion. Italian surrender propaganda faced unique challenges due to the country's complex political situation. The presence of competing Italian governments and the German occupation of northern Italy created confusion about legitimate authority. Allied propaganda had to simultaneously encourage Italian resistance to German occupation while promoting cooperation with Allied forces, a delicate balance that was not always successful. The logistical challenges of processing millions of surrendering Axis troops revealed the scale of Allied victory. The Western Allies established massive prisoner-of-war camps across Europe to handle the influx of German prisoners. The Rheinweisenlager camps housed over 1 million German prisoners at their peak, requiring enormous resources for food, shelter, and medical care. The rapid processing and screening of prisoners to identify war criminals and intelligence sources became a major Allied operation in itself. Japanese prisoner processing proved less challenging due to smaller numbers but created different problems. The cultural shock of surrender and captivity affected Japanese prisoners more severely than their German counterparts. Allied authorities had to develop new approaches to handle prisoners who had been conditioned to view capture as ultimate dishonor. The psychological rehabilitation of Japanese prisoners became as important as their physical care. Italian prisoner processing was complicated by the need to distinguish between legitimate prisoners of war and potential co-belligerents. Many Italian troops captured during the German disarmament operations remained in Allied custody, while their legal status was determined. The formation of Italian service units to support Allied operations provided one solution, but political complications persisted throughout the Italian campaign. The medical dimensions of surrender operations revealed the physical toll of prolonged warfare on Axis forces. German prisoners often showed signs of malnutrition and disease, reflecting the deteriorating conditions within the Wehrmacht during the war's final months. Allied medical officers documented widespread vitamin deficiencies, dental problems, and stress-related illnesses among German prisoners that indicated the true state of German military capabilities. Japanese prisoners presented different medical challenges, often showing evidence of fanatical conditioning and psychological trauma. The rate of suicide attempts among Japanese prisoners exceeded that of other nationalities, requiring special precautions and medical interventions. Allied medical personnel had to develop new techniques for treating prisoners who viewed survival as shameful. Italian prisoners generally showed better physical condition than their German counterparts but often displayed signs of demoralization and confusion about their role in the conflict. The rapid transition from ally to enemy to co-belligerent created psychological stress that manifested in various physical symptoms. Allied medical officers noted higher rates of anxiety and depression among Italian prisoners compared to other nationalities. The legal framework for handling surrender operations evolved throughout the war as the scale of Axis defeat became apparent. The Allied demand for unconditional surrender eliminated traditional diplomatic niceties and required complete military and political capitulation. This approach simplified some aspects of surrender processing but created new challenges in establishing post-war governance and legal systems. German surrender was legally complicated by the complete collapse of government authority and the need to establish Allied control over all aspects of German society. The Allied Control Council became the supreme authority in occupied Germany, with powers exceeding those of any previous military occupation. The legal fiction of German government continuation was abandoned in favor of direct Allied rule. Japanese surrender retained the formal structure of government while transferring real authority to Allied occupation forces. This compromise allowed for more orderly transition while maintaining Japanese administrative capability needed for effective occupation. The retention of the emperor system, despite demands for his trial as a war criminal, proved crucial to securing Japanese compliance with occupation directives. Italian surrender created the precedent for co-belligerent status that would influence post-war arrangements in other liberated countries. The recognition of Italy as a partner in the war against Germany, despite its previous Axis membership, provided a model for reintegrating former enemies into the Allied coalition. However, this status remained contentious throughout the Italian campaign and influenced post-war territorial arrangements. The documentation of surrender processes became crucial for establishing historical records and legal precedents. Allied forces systematically photographed and filmed surrender ceremonies to provide evidence of Axis defeat and Allied authority. These records served both immediate propaganda purposes and long-term historical documentation needs. German surrender documentation focused on demonstrating the complete military defeat of Nazi Germany and the transfer of authority to Allied forces. The signing ceremonies at Reims and Berlin were carefully choreographed to emphasize German submission and Allied unity. The preservation of surrender documents and related materials became important evidence for post-war trials and reparations negotiations. Japanese surrender documentation emphasized the role of traditional authority in securing compliance with Allied demands. The emperor's recorded surrender announcement was preserved as crucial evidence of Japan's acceptance of defeat. The formal ceremony aboard Missouri provided dramatic visual evidence of American dominance in the Pacific and Japan's acceptance of occupation. Italian surrender documentation reflected the complex political situation surrounding Italy's change of sides. The secret negotiations and public announcements had to be carefully documented to establish the legitimacy of Allied Italian cooperation. The confusion surrounding the armistice announcement and German reaction required extensive documentation to clarify the sequence of events and legal implications. The industrial aftermath of surrender operations revealed the true scope of Axis economic collapse. German war production had effectively ceased by April 1945 due to transportation breakdown, raw material shortages, and facility destruction. The systematic dismantling of German industrial capacity continued for years after surrender, fundamentally altering the European economic balance. German factory workers faced uncertain futures as Allied authorities determined which facilities would be dismantled or converted to peaceful production. The removal of equipment for reparations eliminated thousands of jobs while creating opportunities for Allied competitors. The confiscation of German patents and trade secrets represented an additional transfer of economic value that affected German competitiveness for decades. Japanese industrial capacity suffered similar devastation through bombing and raw material shortages. The prohibition on aircraft production and limitations on other military-related industries fundamentally changed Japan's economic structure. The need to rebuild with peaceful technologies and civilian markets required massive reorientation of Japanese industry and workforce. Italian industrial recovery was complicated by the destruction of war and the need to transition from wartime to peacetime production. Northern Italian industry, which had supported German war efforts under occupation, faced particular challenges in demonstrating compatibility with Allied objectives. The reconstruction of Italian industry required extensive Allied oversight and investment. The agricultural dimensions of surrender revealed another aspect of Axis collapse. German food production had declined severely due to labor shortages, fertilizer scarcity, and transportation problems. The influx of millions of prisoners and displaced persons strained already inadequate food supplies, creating humanitarian crises that lasted months after surrender. German farmers faced the challenge of producing food without adequate equipment, fuel, or fertilizer while supporting increased populations of prisoners and refugees. Allied authorities organized emergency programs using released German prisoners of war to assist with harvests, but productivity remained far below pre-war levels. The caloric intake of German civilians fell to starvation levels in many areas during the immediate post-surrender period. Japanese agriculture faced similar challenges compounded by the loss of overseas territories that had provided crucial food imports. The destruction of the merchant marine eliminated access to international markets while domestic production suffered from labor shortages and fertilizer scarcity. The threat of famine in post-surrender Japan required massive Allied food assistance to prevent humanitarian disaster. Italian agriculture in the south struggled with damaged infrastructure and disrupted markets while northern regions faced exploitation under German occupation. The fighting throughout the Italian peninsula destroyed crops, livestock, and farm equipment while displacing rural populations. The reconstruction of Italian agriculture required years of Allied assistance and investment. The transportation dimensions of surrender operations demonstrated the scope of modern warfare's impact on civilian infrastructure. German transportation networks had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, making the movement of troops, supplies, and civilians extremely difficult by war's end. The restoration of basic transportation capability became a prerequisite for post-war recovery. German railways, which had been the backbone of Wehrmacht logistics, were reduced to fragments by sustained Allied bombing. The systematic targeting of marshalling yards, bridges, and locomotive facilities effectively paralyzed German transportation by April 1945. The restoration of rail service required massive Allied investment and German labor over several years. Japanese transportation faced similar destruction through bombing combined with raw material shortages that prevented maintenance and replacement. The loss of shipping eliminated overseas transportation while domestic railways and roads deteriorated rapidly. The Allied occupation required the restoration of basic transportation capability to maintain administrative control and support reconstruction efforts. Italian transportation suffered from both war damage and the competing demands of German occupation forces and Allied armies. The destruction of bridges, tunnels, and railways during German retreats created obstacles that lasted months to repair. The restoration of transportation networks became crucial for Italian economic recovery and political reunification. The communications aspects of surrender operations revealed the importance of information control in modern warfare. German communications had been severely compromised by Allied bombing and intelligence operations, contributing to the Wehrmacht's loss of command and control in the final weeks. The capture of German communications equipment provided valuable intelligence about Axis capabilities and limitations. German radio and telephone networks suffered systematic destruction that prevented effective coordination of resistance efforts. The Allied control of German broadcasting facilities allowed immediate dissemination of surrender terms and occupation directives. The preservation of some communications capability proved essential for Allied administration of occupied Germany. Japanese communications remained partially functional until surrender but faced increasing degradation from bombing and material shortages. The Emperor's surrender broadcast required careful coordination to ensure nationwide dissemination while preventing military interference. The maintenance of basic communications capability proved crucial for implementing occupation directives and preventing disorder. Italian communications faced the complex challenge of serving competing authorities during the German occupation and Allied liberation. The need to coordinate with both German forces and Allied armies created security risks that limited effective communications. The restoration of unified communication systems became important for Italian political reunification and administrative efficiency. The cultural dimensions of surrender revealed fundamental differences in national attitudes toward defeat and occupation. German culture had experienced military defeat before but never complete occupation and dismantling of national institutions. The psychological impact of total defeat created lasting changes in German political and social attitudes that influenced post-war development. German civilian reaction to surrender varied by region and experience, but generally reflected relief at the end of bombing and fighting combined with anxiety about occupation and future prospects. The systematic denazification programs attempted to address German complicity in Nazi crimes while rebuilding democratic institutions. The success of these efforts varied considerably across different social groups and regions. Japanese culture faced unprecedented challenges in adapting to defeat and occupation after centuries of isolation and independence. The preservation of the emperor system provided crucial continuity but could not eliminate the psychological trauma of complete military defeat. The adaptation to democratic institutions and values required fundamental changes in Japanese social and political culture. Italian culture experienced the unique challenge of transitioning from enemy to ally while under partial occupation. The civil war aspects of the Italian campaign created divisions that lasted beyond military victory. The reconstruction of Italian national identity required reconciliation between different regions and political groups that had fought on opposite sides. The educational aspects of surrender operations addressed the need to reshape national consciousness and prepare populations for democratic governance. German educational institutions required complete restructuring to eliminate Nazi ideology and promote democratic values. The Allied control of German universities and schools provided opportunities to influence future generations but also created resistance from traditional academic authorities. German students and teachers faced the challenge of abandoning years of Nazi indoctrination while adapting to new political and social realities. The introduction of democratic concepts and critical thinking represented fundamental changes in German educational philosophy. The success of educational reform varied considerably between different regions and social groups. Japanese education faced similar challenges in eliminating militaristic and imperial ideology while preserving valuable cultural traditions. The introduction of democratic principles and individual rights represented major departures from traditional Japanese educational philosophy. The cooperation of Japanese educators proved crucial for successful reform implementation. Italian education required less dramatic restructuring due to the shorter period of fascist control and the retention of traditional institutions. However, the need to promote democratic values and national unity after civil war created significant challenges. The reconstruction of Italian educational systems required careful balance between reform and continuity. The religious dimensions of surrender operations reflected the complex relationships between national identity and spiritual beliefs. German churches faced the challenge of addressing their complicity in Nazi crimes while maintaining spiritual authority. The role of religious institutions in post-war reconstruction varied considerably between different denominations and regions. German Protestant and Catholic churches had responded differently to Nazi rule, creating different post-war challenges and opportunities. The confession of guilt by Protestant leaders provided one model for addressing collective responsibility, while Catholic institutions emphasized continuity and traditional values. The restoration of religious freedom became important for German psychological and spiritual recovery. Japanese religious institutions faced the challenge of adapting to secular governance while maintaining traditional practices and beliefs. The disestablishment of state Shinto eliminated the religious basis for imperial authority while preserving local religious traditions. The introduction of religious freedom allowed new forms of spiritual expression while maintaining cultural continuity. Italian religious institutions benefited from the Vatican's neutral status and traditional influence in Italian society. The role of Catholic institutions in resistance activities provided legitimacy for post-war reconstruction efforts. The restoration of religious authority helped stabilize Italian society during the transition from war to peace. The technological legacy of surrender operations influenced post-war development in ways that lasted decades. The transfer of German rocket technology accelerated space exploration programs in both the United States and Soviet Union. The competition to acquire German scientists and research data became an early aspect of Cold War rivalry that shaped subsequent technological development. German advances in jet propulsion, guided missiles, and nuclear research provided foundations for post-war military and civilian technologies. The systematic exploitation of German industrial processes and scientific knowledge represented one of the largest technology transfers in history. The impact of this transfer continued to influence technological development long after the immediate post-war period. Japanese technological contributions proved more limited but still significant in areas such as optics, radar, and long-range aircraft design. The examination of Japanese equipment and techniques provided insights that influenced Allied military and civilian development. However, the destruction of Japanese research facilities limited the scope of technology transfer compared to Germany. Italian technological contributions were minimal due to limited research capabilities and early surrender. However, Italian expertise in specific areas such as naval architecture and precision manufacturing provided some value for Allied reconstruction efforts. The preservation of Italian technical skills proved important for post-war economic recovery. The medical legacy of surrender operations provided crucial insights into the treatment of large-scale trauma and displacement. The care of millions of prisoners, refugees, and displaced persons required new approaches to mass medical care and psychological treatment. The lessons learned during surrender operations influenced post-war medical practice and international humanitarian law. The treatment of combat fatigue and psychological trauma among surrendering troops provided early insights into what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Allied medical personnel developed new techniques for handling psychological casualties that influenced subsequent military and civilian medical practice. The documentation of these experiences provided valuable research data for future conflicts. The prevention and treatment of disease among large populations of prisoners and displaced persons required innovative public health approaches. The Allied medical services developed new systems for mass immunization, disease surveillance, and epidemic control that influenced post-war public health programs. The coordination of medical care across national boundaries provided models for international health cooperation. The nutritional challenges of feeding millions of prisoners and displaced persons led to advances in food science and distribution systems. The development of emergency rations and nutritional supplements provided foundations for subsequent humanitarian operations. The logistics of food distribution to displaced populations influenced post-war relief programs and international aid systems. By the time the last German units surrendered on the Hel Peninsula on May 14, 1945, the statistics were undeniable. 2.8 million German soldiers had chosen surrender to Western forces over death or capture by Soviet troops. 15,000 had died for attempting what these millions achieved. The mathematics of survival that Heinrich Waldmann had calculated in that Bavarian forest proved tragically accurate. Surrender to the West meant life, resistance meant death, and flight to the East meant something worse than death. The three models of surrender, German pragmatism in the West, Japanese fanatical resistance, and Italian opportunistic reversal, revealed fundamental differences in how nations and cultures confront total defeat. Germany's acceptance of unconditional surrender represented the triumph of individual survival instincts over ideological commitment. Japan's requirement for imperial intervention demonstrated the power of traditional authority even in modern warfare. Italy's transformation from enemy to ally showed the possibilities and complications of political reversal during wartime. The industrial and technological consequences of these surrenders shaped the post-war world in ways still visible today. The transfer of German technology accelerated space exploration and military development for decades. The dismantling of Axis industrial capacity eliminated competitor nations while transferring assets to the victorious allies. The human cost, millions of military and civilian casualties, massive displacement of populations, and destruction of entire societies, demonstrated the total nature of modern warfare. The young German soldier who emerged from the Bavarian forest in April 1945 had calculated correctly. Among the 2.8 million who chose surrender, Heinrich Waldmann survived Soviet occupation, American prisoner of war camps, and the reconstruction of Germany. He returned to his family farm in Württemberg in 1947, married his childhood sweetheart, and raised 3 children who would grow up in a democratic Germany allied with its former enemies. The mathematics of survival had led to life, not merely because he had chosen correctly, but because the age of total war had finally ended. The choice between resistance and surrender, between ideology and survival, between honor and pragmatism, had been made by millions of individuals in impossible circumstances. Their decisions, documented in the precise statistics of surrender and death, survival and destruction, wrote the final chapter of the Second World War. The war had begun with promises of glory and empire. It ended with the simple recognition that sometimes the greatest victory is the decision to live.